I was tired of my boyfriend, and his brother proposed to me after winning the lottery. Of course I accepted, but it turned out it was a test from my boyfriend to see if I was a gold digger. They put my face on speakerphone, literally as if I were a national joke, and I just stood there with a smile plastered on my face, feeling the shame rise up my neck. Everyone was talking at once, but I only heard one phrase bouncing around over and over like a hammer. It was a test. Javier, my boyfriend, didn't even shout, and that was the worst part, because when someone doesn't shout, it's because they've already decided you're not worth the volume. Esteban, his brother, was there in his new money suit, looking at me as if I were an experiment that turned out exactly as they expected. And in that second, I understood that the story wasn't going to be about a lottery, but about how they tried to humiliate me and how I don't plan on letting them get away with it without it costing them. I met Javier in a place where people drink expensive coffee just to hold the cup with the brand facing the camera. He was there for work, always with that serious man energy who knows how to talk about numbers without sounding ridiculous. And I honestly thought he was the kind of stability a woman like me deserves. I'm not going to pretend it was for his heart, because no one pays for the internet with feelings, and my vision for life has always been clear. I was going to be someone. He treated me well, too well, with that patience of a man who thinks love is shown by washing dishes and paying bills without being asked. And yes, at first I found that cute, but then it started to smell like conformism, like that kind of slow life where you become invisible. Javier was one of those who are proud of being simple, and his family too. And for me, that was always a culture clash. I grew up with the idea that if you're not moving forward, you're moving backward, and I'm not a woman who's going to stay in saving mode my whole life. He talked about long-term plans as if that were sexy, and I talked about opportunities, positioning, image, not living as if the world ended in the neighborhood. Every time we went to visit his parents, I felt like I was entering a museum of humility with 20-year-old furniture and conversations about how the important thing is to be together. And I'd smile, of course, because one knows how to be diplomatic, but inside I thought that mentality is what keeps people stuck forever. I've always liked aesthetics, the aspirational, what looks good and feels better. Not because I'm superficial, but because the world works on perception, and whoever says otherwise is lying or resigned. I really tried to push Javier to understand that you can't live your whole life just seeing what happens, and that his comfort ceiling was too low for me. He'd say I was intense, as if ambition were a flaw and not a sign of intelligence. And that's where that silly tension began, that little game of him playing the humble one and me carrying the weight of the vision. As always, Esteban, his brother, was the opposite, and that was the first thing I noticed. I didn't see him much because according to Javier, he was into things, and you know how families are when someone doesn't fit in. They call him a problem so they don't have to admit he just doesn't follow the manual. But every time Esteban showed up, he showed up with presence, with that almost aggressive confidence of men who don't ask for permission to exist. To me, that kind of energy seems real, not like Javier's domestic peace, which sometimes felt like sedation. And although Javier would never admit it, there was something there. A silent competition, a resentment, and discomfort that he hid with smiles. Javier always talked to me about building, saving for something, small steps, patience. And I'd tell him that if he wanted a small life, fine, but don't drag me down with his emotional mediocrity. He'd get offended by that word, as if mediocrity were an insult and not a diagnosis. I'm not the type to settle for a boyfriend. Well, if that boyfriend isn't hungry for more. And yes, I know that sounds harsh, but reality is harsh, and no one is here to sing lullabies to men. The last straw for me wasn't one single thing, but the accumulated exhaustion of feeling like I was the only one pushing life forward. I'd talk about projects, about growing on social media, about turning my image into something profitable, and he'd look at me as if I were a teenager. He'd tell me to get a normal job, as if normal were a goal and not a cage. I started to notice how he'd correct me in front of people in that calm man way that humiliates you without raising his voice. Valeria exaggerates. Valeria lives in her own world, and you just swallow it, until one day you decide you're not going to be the one who adapts anymore. Then Esteban appeared as if the universe had dropped him on purpose at the exact right moment. He arrived at a family gathering in a suit too elegant for the place, a smile too confident, and news that honestly changed the air in the house. He said he had won the lottery, just like that, bluntly. And I saw how everyone's face fell for a second, because humble people don't know what to do with big money. Javier stood there, stiff, weird, as if he wasn't happy. And that seemed suspicious to me, because if my partner wins something like that, I get excited, I celebrate it, I hug him. But not him. He looked at him like someone looking at a person who ruined the script. Esteban started talking about new plans, about investing, about moving, about how serious things were coming now. And I, who have spent years listening to Javier repeat, "We'll see," felt an almost physical relief, as if someone was finally speaking my language. I'm not going to play the saint. I saw an opportunity to be with someone who isn't afraid of greatness. And I also saw Javier's face, that "I'm not like that" face, as if being like that were a bad thing. That's when I realized my relationship was hanging by a thread, and that thread was Javier's ego. Esteban, out of nowhere, looked directly at me in front of everyone and said that he had always admired my ambition, that he saw in me a woman who deserves more than a man with fear. And look, I'm not made of stone. When someone recognizes what you bring to the table, it touches you, because I've had to fight for every crumb of validation in that house. Javier tried to joke about it, minimizing it, and Esteban laughed in a way that wasn't a laugh. It was domination. And, honestly, I found it sexy that someone put Javier in his place without apologizing. Then Esteban did the unthinkable. He took out the ticket, talked about financial security, and proposed to me. Just like that, in the middle of the living room, with everyone watching as if it were a live episode of a cheap reality show. I felt the world stop, because it's one thing to fantasize about a different life and another to have it served to you on a platter in front of your boyfriend. Javier turned pale, and in that moment, I thought, if he really loved me, he'd understand that this is a test of his maturity too. But his face said something else. It said he wanted to control the stage. And yes, I accepted, because first, no one was going to humiliate me by telling me I'm not worthy of a big life. Second, because Esteban was offering what Javier never offered me, certainty, progress, a leap. Third, because I was already tired of being the villain for wanting more, and there was more knocking on my door with a ring included. When Javier reacted, I wasn't going to shrink to make him feel better. I said in front of everyone what I had been thinking for a long time, that there was finally a man in that family who was good for something. I saw how the air tensed, how Javier's parents froze, how someone let out a nervous laugh. Javier looked at me as if I had just killed him, but no, I didn't kill him. I just said what he could never stand to hear. Esteban smiled like someone who had already won and started talking about plans for a house, for travel, for investments. And I, in my head, was already arranging my life on a new board, one where I didn't have to ask for permission to aspire. What I didn't know is that they had already written the end of that scene, because suddenly they laughed. Not a happy laugh, but that dirty laugh of people who think they've figured you out. Esteban said it was a lie, that the ticket was fake, that the suit was rented, that it was all a test from Javier. And when I heard the word test, I felt like cold water had been thrown in my face. Not because they caught me, but because they put on a show for me, as if I were an animal for exhibition. Javier, with that cheap psychologist's calmness, said he already knew, that he just wanted to see how much of a gold digger I was, as if he were a judge and I were an accused, as if his love were a job interview where I had to pass filters to deserve him. And, obviously, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I laughed too. I laughed loudly and said I was also joking, that if Javier didn't understand humor, that was his problem. They expected tears, apologies, shame, something that would make them feel like winners. And I didn't give it to them. I said it was ridiculous that they took a family joke so seriously, that I was participating in the game, that everyone was exaggerating. Javier started with his little, "It wasn't like that" tone, and I replied that he shouldn't play the saint, that he set up the circus and then gets scared when someone acts. The truth is, if Javier wanted to portray me as a gold digger, I was going to portray him as obsessive and controlling. Later, when everything calmed down, Javier insinuated that the best thing would be for me to leave for a while. And that's where I realized his real plan wasn't to learn. It was to kick me out. Because a man who loves you doesn't test you and then want to kick you out of your own house as if you were an intruder. I told him I wasn't leaving, that he couldn't play with my life and then pretend I'll disappear so he can look like the hurt hero. If he wanted distance, he should take it himself, because I didn't do anything illegal. I just reacted to what they put in front of me. And while he played the victim, I started to see something else. If Esteban was capable of setting up that scene, it's because he has initiative, because he knows how to manipulate the environment, because he knows how to move emotions. And that's the shark mentality that interests me, the one Javier hates, because he can't control it. I stayed in the house not out of necessity, but out of strategy, because I wasn't going to let them corner me as if I were ashamed to be hidden. Besides, if they wanted to paint me as a gold digger, I was going to use that paint for my own picture, not theirs. I started talking to Esteban differently, more directly, more like adults, not to beg him for anything, but to make it clear that if he really has ambition, he knows how to recognize someone who also has it. Javier would find out and get nervous, because control was slipping from his hands. And that, for me, was the real test, the proof that Javier didn't want a partner. He wanted a woman who would adore him and thank him for the bare minimum. And I wasn't born to be grateful for crumbs. I was born to demand what I deserve. The main story ends there, with Javier thinking he unmasked me and me staying in the house with my head held high, pretending the ridiculous scene was a collective misunderstanding. He thought the blow would take me out of the game, but all it did was confirm that I was surrounded by people capable of humiliating me to feel superior. And if they play dirty, I'm not going to be the only fool playing fair. Because when someone runs an experiment on you, the least they deserve is for the results to blow up in their face. Comments on the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, "You accepted a marriage proposal in the living room in front of your boyfriend for a lottery ticket, and on top of that you told him there was finally a man in that family who was good for something. It wasn't a joke, you sold yourself for a rented suit and ended up as the perfect caricature of a gold digger." OP's response: "How convenient that you ignore that Javier was the one who set up the show as if I were his trained pet. If I accepted, it was because they're not going to make me look like the submissive fool who swallows humiliation and then apologizes. And the good for something part isn't a lie, it just hurt them to hear it out loud because they're used to applauding mediocrity." Anonymous user 2 says, "The best part is that when they told you it was a test, instead of saying, 'I made a mistake,' you made up that you were also joking. So they ran an experiment on you, and your reaction was automatic gaslighting, and you still stayed in the house as if that were strategy and not pure nerve." OP's response: "And you wanted me to kneel so Javier could feel powerful? No, darling. I don't negotiate my dignity with people who think love is measured with traps. If I stayed, it was because I have rights too, and because he's not my owner to tell me leave for a while, as if I were a bag of trash. He's the one with nerve for inventing tests to justify wanting to kick me out." Update 1. It's been 3 days since the last update. The 3 days after the circus were weird, like when a mirror breaks and you keep walking through the house seeing pieces of yourself in every reflection. Javier went from a calm man to a cold administrator, and I swear that's scarier than a shout. He didn't insult me, he didn't follow me, he didn't make scenes. He just moved as if I were a logistical problem he wanted to solve. I saw him coming and going on his phone, writing things, making calls with that calmness only people who think they've already won have. And I obviously stood my ground because if I showed weakness, he would use it as a trophy. The first real sign that he wanted to punish me was when I tried to pay for something as normal as a delivery order and the card didn't go through. At first I thought it was the machine or the app because those things fail, but the second one didn't go through either, and that's when it smelled like a plan to me. I texted him because he was in another room, and he replied dryly that he had canceled the supplementary cards. Just like that, without a conversation, without a warning, without anything, as if I were an employee fired overnight. I felt rage, not because of the money itself, but because of the message: "I'll cut off your oxygen so you learn." When I confronted him, he told me that if I wanted expenses, my millionaire future husband should pay for them. Imagine the level of sarcasm, as if what he did wasn't public humiliation and emotional manipulation. I told him he was being cruel, that he was using money as a weapon, and he just stood there with that offended saint face. He told me he wasn't going to finance a woman who was ready to trade him for his brother. And that's when I understood he didn't want to fix anything. He wanted to rewrite the story to make himself a martyr and me the official villain. In my head, I started doing quick calculations because when they cut off your resources, all you have left is instinct. I didn't have my own money saved because honestly, I was focused on growing on social media, and that requires time, energy, image. Javier always said it was fine, that he supported it, until it was no longer convenient for him, and now suddenly it was supporting me. I couldn't be left empty-handed while he played the hero. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when a man decides to punish you, he doesn't stop at the symbolic. He goes for your stability. So I started observing the house as if it were enemy territory. Javier has this obsession with emergencies, with keeping cash as if we were at war. I knew he had a safe because I saw him more than once putting envelopes in there, telling me it was in case something happened. He always hid the code when he entered it, but people get complacent. And I'm not blind. I had seen it out of the corner of my eye more than once, as if I wasn't looking, and at that moment I understood that the emergency was already happening, and the emergency was him. I didn't do it out of malice. I did it for balance. If he could cut off my access to everything without talking about it, I could make sure I wasn't trapped. I waited for him to leave, because I'm not stupid enough to do it with him watching. I opened the safe with the code I had memorized, and it was almost ridiculous how easy it was, as if the universe were proving me right. The money was there, in cash, organized, like proof that he planned to survive without me while I was left looking like the crazy one. I took that money with a strange feeling, as if I were recovering something that was mine anyway. Because when you share a life with someone, you also share what's built, even if men act like moral accountants. In my mind, it wasn't theft. It was compensation for the humiliation, for the control, for the damage. And besides, I had a plan. It wasn't like I was going to spend it on makeup or parties like people want to imagine. I was going to invest it, move it, turn it into something bigger, as one is supposed to do. And that's where Esteban comes in again, because yes, I looked for him, not to beg for a ring, but to test him, because if he talked so much about sharks and big mentality, he should prove it. I texted him, and he agreed to meet me, and he arrived with that I control the weather attitude that bothers Javier so much. I told him directly that I had money, that we could invest in something, and I saw how his eyes lit up. And that confirmed to me that even if the ticket was fake, his ambition was real, and ambition is the only thing you can't rent. I told him the phrase exactly as it was, because I don't know how to disguise the obvious, that he had potential, not like his brother. It wasn't to hurt Javier for sport. It was to mark a difference that already existed. Esteban laughed and said he liked the way I thought, that I really understood the game. I gave him the money in an envelope because in my head, this was an alliance, a strategic move. And I left feeling like I was finally taking control of the narrative, that I wasn't going to be the punished woman in silence. What I didn't see, because no one told me and I'm not a psychic, is that Esteban wasn't a businessman. He was a man with demons. Javier always talked about him as complicated, but of course, he never gave details because that family loves to hide the ugly stuff to appear proper. If they had told me that Esteban was a recovering gambling addict, I would have handled this differently, because that's not a joke. But no one told me, and I wasn't going to investigate an adult's life as if I were his mother. I just saw a hungry man, and hunger in a normal world is channeled into business, not into roulette wheels. That same night, Esteban disappeared. He didn't answer texts, he didn't answer calls, he didn't show up where we were supposed to meet to talk more about the plan. At first, I thought it was the typical power play, that he wanted me to look for him, that he wanted to act important. But then that dense silence started to creep in, like when something is wrong and your body knows it before your mind does. And I had a horrible feeling that I had pulled the pin on a grenade without knowing if the safety was on. When Javier found out I had touched the safe, his face changed completely. He was no longer the hurt boyfriend. He was the man who looks at you as if you are a real threat. He told me I was a thief, that he was going to destroy me, that I had crossed a line of no return. And I told him he had crossed his when he decided to test me like an object and then cut off my access to everything. He tried to be a moralist, but I saw his panic. It wasn't about the money. It was about losing control. That night, while I was trying to locate Esteban, Javier locked himself in the room, and I heard him talking on the phone. I don't know with whom, but his tone was low, calculated, as if he were already planning the next chapter to sink me. I stayed in the living room with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen as if by staring, I could force Esteban to answer. And that's when I first felt that karma, the thing people talk about, isn't magic. It's consequences. Because I had made a strong move, yes, but so had they, and I didn't know how far they would go. At the end of those 3 days, the reality was this. I was left without cards, without the cash I took because it was out of my hands, and with a Javier willing to paint me as a criminal. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the feeling that for the first time, I didn't have a clean way out. I was trapped between a boyfriend with a judge complex and a brother who evaporated with my only leverage. And as Esteban's silence grew, I felt that something was going to explode, and that explosion was going to land on me. Because when you invest in the wrong person, you don't lose money. You lose the right to be believed. Comments on Update 1. Anonymous User 1 says, so, they cancel your cards for obvious reasons and your response is to spy on a safe's code, steal the savings, and give it to the brother because you liked his shark mentality. That's not strategy, Valeria. That's stealing, and on top of that, financing the addiction of a guy who disappears into a casino the same night. OP's response, I love how you reduce it to obvious reasons when the little gentleman set up a public test to humiliate me and then tried to leave me with no access to anything as punishment. I didn't finance an addiction. I moved resources so I wouldn't be at the mercy of a man who thinks controlling me with money is acceptable. And if Esteban disappeared, that says something about him and the family that covered for him, not me. Anonymous User 2 says, the funniest part is that you think you're so smart, but your plan was to give an envelope of cash to a guy who already proved to you it was all an act, and you're still surprised he disappeared. Javier sized you up perfectly. You react as if the world owes you luxury, and when they take it away, you commit crimes. OP's response, funny how you think I was going to sit still while he cut everything off and slapped the gold digger label on me as if it were a verdict. If anyone here was acting, it was Javier. And if anyone committed an emotional crime, it was him with his game of tests. I reacted because they pushed me. And if you've never been in a situation where they try to corner you financially, it shows. Update 2. It's been a week since the last update. The following week was a silent hell, one of those that makes no noise, but peels away your sleep in layers, as if someone were patiently peeling off your skin. Javier stopped arguing with me because he didn't need to anymore. When someone decides to destroy you, the last thing they do is fight. He moved through the house like an owner inspecting a property before selling it, with a cold gaze, measuring what stays and what goes. I kept trying to locate Esteban, but every call went to voicemail, every message was left on read or didn't even go through, as if the air had swallowed him. And in that climate, where I was already without cards and without cash, Javier waited for the perfect moment to drop the bomb. I noticed it before it happened because he started asking those soft questions that seem casual but are actually interrogations. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help, if I wanted to talk to someone, with that reasonable man voice used to paint the other person as hysterical. I told him I was perfectly fine, that he was the one who needed therapy for his obsession with running tests and playing moral games. He nodded without arguing, and that's what made my blood run cold, because when Javier stayed quiet, it was because he already had the next move ready. That same night, he locked himself in the room, and I heard him make a long, very long phone call in a kind, almost worried tone. The next day, without telling me anything, Javier said people were coming over. I thought it was his family because, of course, they always call the family when they want to put on a show of unity, as if that legitimizes anything. I got ready anyway, because I'm not one to be seen broken, and I sat in the living room as if I were receiving normal visitors. When the doorbell rang and I saw my parents, I understood that Javier wasn't looking for solutions. He was looking for witnesses, and that's when I felt real rage, because it's one thing to fight with your partner and another to bring in your in-laws to stage an intervention as if you were a lost cause. My parents came in with that face they have when they think they're coming to save you from yourself. My mom didn't hug me. She scanned me as if looking for physical signs of a moral disaster, and my dad didn't even look me in the eye at first. Javier greeted him as if he were the heroic victim, the good man who no longer knows what to do with me. And then, with that manipulative calmness, he told them that I had relapsed into vices, that I was into strange things, that I had stolen money from him. He used the word vices with cruel precision because he knew exactly how that sounds coming from a family. It sounds like public shame. I was frozen, not out of guilt, but because of the strategy. Because stealing, according to him, was me taking money that had been used in my life anyway, but lying like that, inventing a relapse into vices, that for him was valid because he does it from the role of a hurt man. My mom put her hand to her chest as if he had told her I was in a cult, and my dad clenched his jaw, and Javier just sat there observing me, waiting for me to explode to have his scene confirmed. I breathed, because if I screamed, he would win. I tried to explain, but Javier would cut me off with short phrases that took my breath away. He said I was desperate, that I had become obsessed with money, that I was out of control. And the worst part is that my parents, because of how they are, believe the calm man more than the daughter who defends herself. I could see the old-fashioned judgment in their eyes, that idea that if a man says something serenely, then it must be true. That's when I realized Javier didn't just want me to lose the relationship. He wanted me to lose my reputation and my network. As soon as they went to the kitchen with Javier for some air, I was left alone in the living room and felt like I was on a countdown. I couldn't let my family leave with that idea, not because I care about their morals, but because they control doors, they control support, they control the narrative. And if they left there thinking I was a relapse, I was socially dead, tied to their surveillance, their sermons, their financial control. I needed to replace the money before Javier's lie became my official label. So my mind did what it always does, look for a quick move. I thought of the jewelry. Javier had given me jewelry throughout the relationship, on birthdays, anniversaries, in those moments when he wanted to feel like a romantic provider. I always saw it as an investment because that's the smart thing to do. If someone gives you something valuable, you save it for when you need it. And don't come at me saying that's cold, because life doesn't warn you when they're going to pull the rug out from under you. If I sold that jewelry, I could get the cash back, return it, shut everyone up, and leave Javier looking like he was exaggerating, like a paranoid man. While my parents were in the kitchen, I went to the room, opened the drawer where I kept everything, and started picking out pieces. It wasn't with sadness. It was with urgency, because urgency doesn't let you feel. I chose the ones that looked heaviest, the shiniest, the ones I always assumed were real gold and not little trinkets. I put them in my purse and left with an excuse, saying I was going to get some air too. My mom wanted to follow me, but I told her I needed a moment alone, and I left before they could put an emotional tracker on me. I went to a well-known jewelry store, not a neighborhood one, because I wasn't going to risk being scammed with urgency written on my face. I walked in with my posture high, with that energy of a woman who knows what she has, even though my hands were shaking inside. The jeweler looked at me with that just another one face, because you can tell when someone comes in a hurry, but I kept my cool. I told him I wanted to sell and that I needed a quick appraisal. He took the pieces, looked at them, weighed them, tested them, and his face didn't change, and that was weird. At first, I thought he was playing games, that he wanted to lowball me to take advantage, but then he dropped the sentence with a tranquility that broke me in two, that these pieces weren't gold, that they were fakes, that some were plated, that others were cheap alloys, that the real value was minimal. I laughed as a reflex, because my brain doesn't easily accept a new humiliation when it's already dealing with another. I told him he was mistaken, that this jewelry was a gift from my partner, that it couldn't be. He showed me marks, tests, numbers, as if he were explaining it to a child. In that instant, I felt a mix of disgust and rage that I can't describe. Not just because of the money, but because of the intention behind it. Because it's not that Javier couldn't buy real gold, he could. He just didn't want to. He had given me fake things for years, not by mistake, but by calculation, out of fear, out of his paranoia that I was materialistic. So he had been testing me from the beginning in silence, like someone feeding an animal fake food to see if it complains. And suddenly, the entire relationship reconfigured itself in my head. His speeches about modesty, his plans, his obsession with control, it was all a defense against me. I left the jewelry store with my purse heavy with pieces that were worth almost nothing and a shame that burned in my stomach. That's where I understood that I wasn't playing against a hurt man, but against a man who had spent years preparing for the day I proved what he already believed. I went back to the house feeling as if my emotional makeup had been ripped off. My parents were still sitting there with Javier talking like a therapist, and I walked in with a calmness I don't know where I found, because if I had broken down, they would have locked me in an intervention, and I would no longer have a life of my own. Javier looked at me, and I saw a glint in his eyes as if he knew, as if he had guessed exactly where I went. And that's when a new rage hit me, the rage of realizing someone knows you to manipulate you, not to love you. My mom asked where I had been, and I said walking that I needed air. My dad told me that Javier was worried about me with that phrase that sounds like love, but is actually a lock. Javier said nothing. He just looked at me as if he were waiting for the final confession. At that moment, with the money unrecoverable, with Esteban missing, and with my jewelry being an expensive joke, there was no way to replace anything. Javier's lie to my parents was left hanging like smoke because I had no immediate proof to dismantle it. I tried to explain about Esteban, about the test, about the cards. But it all sounded like excuses because Javier had told his story first and with that sensible man tone. My parents started talking about me coming back home, resting, reconnecting with values, as if I were a rebellious teenager. And I listened to them and only thought that Javier had achieved what he wanted, not just leaving me without resources, but putting a social leash on me. The night ended with my parents saying I was going with them for my own good. Javier stood at the door with that fake pained face, saying he hoped I would recover, as if I were an addict to something and he were a saint. I got in the car with my pride clenched because I wasn't going to cry in front of them, I wasn't going to give them that prize, but inside, I swear, a knot of cold hatred formed, because if he wanted to destroy me with tests and lies, I was also going to find a way to return the favor, even if I didn't know how yet. And the worst part, the thing that stuck like a hook in my mind, was that Esteban was still missing. I hadn't just been left without money. I had been left as the official culprit for that money's disappearance. And if Esteban came back in pieces, I knew the entire family would point to me as the spark. It was like being in the middle of a domino set where they've already pushed the first piece and you're just watching everything fall towards you. The week ended like this, me returning to my parents' house, watched, without money, without real jewelry, and with Javier arranging the narrative so the world would applaud him. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, Javier didn't even have to call the police. He destroyed you with a call to your parents and a couple of words, vices and theft. And you, instead of admitting you stole, ran off to sell jewelry like a soap opera villain, and on top of that, they were fake. It happened because you believe everything in life is solved with appearances. OP's response, oh please, as if saying theft automatically makes it a sacred truth. Javier wanted to leave me with nothing, with zero resources, and my reaction was to try to repair the damage before my family completely bought his story. The fake jewelry doesn't make me look bad. It makes him look bad because it proves he was manipulating and testing me for years like a control freak. Anonymous User 2 says, the best part is that you keep calling it strategy, when in reality your plan was to give cash to a gambling addict and then expect a jewelry store to save your skin. And now you're going to your parents' house under intervention because you were left without cards, without money, and without dignity. Javier played chess with you, and you were playing Monopoly. OP's response, how easy it is to mock when you haven't had a family set up to humiliate you and pull the economic rug out from under you. If I acted fast, it's because he forced me to act fast. And no one told me about Esteban. No one informed me, because that family is expert at hiding what's convenient for them. And if I ended up with my parents on my back, it's because Javier used them as a weapon, not because I'm a child who needs permission to live. Update 3. It's been 6 months since the last update. 6 months later, my life became a cheap version of what I always said I didn't want: routine, surveillance, and emotional poverty disguised as order. My parents put me in their house as if I were a box to be stored in the closet, so it doesn't make noise. They gave me the basement, literally, and call it my space, as if a room that smells like dampness is therapy. Nothing here is mine, not even the air. My mom asks what time I leave, what time I get back, who I talk to, what I buy. And yes, I work at a call center because when they take everything from you and label you a problem, the world doesn't offer you influencer positions. It offers you a headset and a script. At first, I thought it would be temporary, a strategic pause to reorganize. I was still convinced that Javier would eventually feel guilty because that's how men who think they're good work. They need to see themselves as good. But Javier didn't seek reconciliation. Javier sought to close the case. He didn't call to talk. He didn't send a kind message. He didn't ask if I was okay. And the worst part is that in his family, I was left as the crazy gold digger who stole, just like that, without nuance, because they prefer a clear villain to an uncomfortable truth. Meanwhile, here I am, answering calls from angry people about bills, learning what it's like to be humiliated for 8 hours a day for a salary my mom manages. Because yes, my parents control my money. They say it's to help me not to relapse, as if I were addicted to something, when the only addiction I had was to not settling. I get paid, I give them the money, and they give me an allowance, as if I were 5 years old. If I want to buy something, I have to justify it, and that's a slow violence that leaves no bruises, but it leaves rage. My mom checks my social media, suggests I don't post provocative things, as if my image were the cause of the disaster and not men's control. And I bite my tongue because any protest turns into, there she is, she's getting agitated again. In these 6 months, the Esteban issue became a ghost that haunts me. Because Esteban reappeared, of course, as problems usually reappear, not to think but to blame. The family found him in pieces, with debts, with shame, with that defeated face men have when their vice wins, and then they look for someone to blame so they don't have to look in the mirror. And guess who they pointed to first when it was known that I gave him money? Me, as if I had put a gun in his hand and pushed him into the casino. Esteban sent me messages full of hatred, saying I tempted him, that I ruined his recovery, that I exposed him to everyone. I replied, because I'm not one to stay quiet when I'm blamed for things that aren't my fault. I told him he's an adult, that he made the choice, that he disappeared and left me hanging alone. But he has a perfect narrative for himself. I was fine until Valeria arrived with money. And that narrative also serves Javier, because it makes him look like the good brother who always knew and me as the intruder who destroys families. It's a silent pact between men. They protect each other, even if they hate each other, if there's a woman on the outside to blame. And here I am, swallowing that injustice while my mom asks me to pray. One afternoon at the call center, the news hit me like a punch to the chest. It wasn't just any rumor. It was one of those things you find out because the world is small and because humiliation always finds a way. A coworker showed me a photo on social media. Javier was dating a new woman. Not just any girl, not a friend, not a coworker. It was the owner of the jewelry store where I tried to sell the fake pieces. I felt my blood pressure drop because that's not a coincidence. That's irony with malice, as if the universe also wanted to laugh. And the worst part is that in the photo, he looked happy, calm, as if he had never done anything wrong, as if I had been a learning episode, and that's it. At first, I thought it was a lie, a setup, because my mind wanted to protect itself. But then I saw comments, I saw tags, I saw people celebrating his new beginning. The owner of the jewelry store, the same one who looked at me with a pitying face the day they told me my jewelry was fake, was now on Javier's arm. According to what I was told later, she was impressed by how cautious he was, by how smart he was not to buy real gold for a materialistic woman. In other words, my humiliation became his success story. his anecdote of a wise man who protected himself. And that's when I understood that Javier didn't just punish me. He capitalized on my fall. I stared at the photo as if it were a distorted mirror of my life. The man I tried to change and push towards a bigger mentality ended up climbing the social ladder thanks to me, but without me. And I, who wanted to switch brothers for money, ended up in a basement with a controlled salary and a family breathing down my neck. It's as if the world were telling me that ambition comes at a price, but it doesn't charge everyone equally, because Javier now has a woman with her own business, with stability, with a reputation, and I was left as the warning. And that gave me such a pure rage it almost made me laugh. I tried to call Javier that night, not to beg him, but to get some closure, to tell him a few home truths. My mom heard me dialing and snatched the phone from my hand as if I were a sick person in relapse. She told me she wasn't going to reopen the wound, that I had to heal, that I had to be grateful I'm at home. And I almost exploded there, because that's the perfect prison. They lock you up and call it love. I yelled at her that I don't need permission to talk to anyone, and she replied that as long as I live there, I follow her rules. Just like that. They switched me from a controlling boyfriend to controlling parents, as if my destiny were always a leash. The following months were a parade of small humiliations. Seeing Javier post photos in restaurants, traveling, smiling with that woman, while I work extra shifts to buy myself a perfume without my dad asking me why. Listening to my aunts say, "Thank goodness Javier was saved," as if I were an accident. Receiving messages from Esteban blaming me every time he has a bad day, as if I were his official excuse, and feeling every night that my own version of myself is fading for lack of space, for lack of money, for lack of a visible future. That's what they don't tell you about falls. They're not a single blow. They're an erosion. I understood something, although it pains me to say it. I had a good catch, and I didn't know how to play my cards right. Not because Javier was perfect, but because in this world, what matters isn't who is right, but who gets to keep the narrative. And Javier got to keep everything: the victim narrative, the clean reputation, a new partner who celebrates him, the family gathered around his wisdom. And I was left with a label, an intervention, a basement, and a gambling addict brother-in-law who hates me. That's the final irony. I wanted to level up and ended up proving, unintentionally, that Javier was always right to fear me, and I hate him because I know he feels validated now, and that validation is his prize. Sometimes I wonder if Javier even planned the thing with the jewelry, if he knew I would try to sell them, if that's why he chose that specific jewelry store, or if the universe was just mocking me. But it doesn't matter anymore because the result is the same. My pride cost me dearly. I'm still working, still smiling on the phone, still pretending I'm learning because that's what they expect of me. But inside, every time I see the photo of Javier with that woman, a nasty thought lights up. I didn't lose because I was bad. I lost because I got careless. And that idea is dangerous because it doesn't teach you to be better. It teaches you to be colder. The end of this story isn't romantic, it's not fair, it's not restorative. Javier is fine. Esteban is worse and blames me. And I'm trapped in a minimal life that's too big for me. My parents think they saved me, but what they did was forcibly domesticate me. And I'm still here in the basement, listening to the TV upstairs as if it's someone else's life, waiting for the day I have enough to leave without asking for permission. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I'm not going to live like this forever. But I also learned that if I ever bet on someone again, I'm not going to bet with my heart. I'm going to bet with the caution Javier used on me. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, 6 months and you still don't get it. You ended up in a basement with your parents controlling your call center salary because you thought you were superior and you stole from a safe to give it to the shark brother. And now on top of that, you're salty that Javier is dating the owner of the jewelry store when you literally found out there that your jewelry was cheap trinkets. Karma straight to the forehead. OP's response. Karma is a comfortable word for people who enjoy seeing others fall. I'm not in a basement because I deserve it. I'm here because a man decided to use economic control and public humiliation as punishment. And my family went along with it. And the jewelry store thing isn't karma. It's proof of how calculating Javier was. He turned my humiliation into his medal, and that doesn't make him a saint. It makes him strategic and cold. Anonymous User 2 says, the saddest part is that your conclusion isn't I messed up, it's I got careless. In other words, you learned nothing, you just learned to be worse. Javier protected himself from you from the beginning because he smelled your limitless ambition and you gave him all the proof. You accepted a marriage proposal for money. You insulted your boyfriend in front of his family. You stole cash. And you tried to sell gifts. You unmasked yourself. OP's response, sad, is that you celebrate a man who spent years testing his partner as if she were a project, buying fake jewelry to see what happens, and setting up scenes to humiliate me. Yes, I'm ambitious, and I'm not ashamed of it because that ambition is the only thing that has kept me alive when they tried to domesticate me. If I unmasked myself, it was because they pushed me into a corner and I reacted, but he unmasked himself too. It's just that you all love it when the villain has the face of a proper man.